Jack Morrison's hands were inside a dying lioness on the African savanna, fighting to free her trapped cub, while her 500-pound mate watched from 20 feet away. The massive predator should have killed him instantly, but what happened next would shatter everything Jack knew about survival in the wild. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jack Morrison had seen plenty of things in his 38 years working cattle across 3 continents, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found that scorching July morning on the Kenyan savanna. The sun beat down mercilessly as he rode his mare Sadie across the golden grasslands of the Masai Mara, checking the boundaries of the conservation ranch where he'd been working for the past 2 years. Most folks back in Montana couldn't understand why a cowboy would trade the familiar plains of America for the wild expanse of Africa. But Jack had always been drawn to places where the rules were different, where nature still held dominion over man's carefully laid plans. The sound reached him first, a low guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath Sadie's hooves. It was the kind of sound that made every hair on the back of his neck stand at attention, the kind of sound that spoke of suffering and desperation. Jack pulled on the reins, bringing his horse to a halt, and listened intently. There it was again, coming from a cluster of acacia trees about 200 yards to his left. Sadie snorted nervously, her ears flicking back and forth as she picked up the scent of something that didn't belong in their usual routine. Jack had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and to trust his horse's instincts even more. Whatever was making that sound was in serious trouble, and despite the very sensible voice in his head telling him to radio back to camp and wait for backup, he found himself guiding Sadie toward the trees. As they drew closer, the moaning grew louder, interspersed with sounds of movement in the tall grass. Jack dismounted about 50 feet from the tree line, tying Sadie's reins to a sturdy branch, and continued on foot, his hand resting on the tranquilizer gun he always carried when riding the perimeter. The lioness lay in the shade of the largest acacia, her golden coat matted with sweat and dust, her flanks heaving with labored breaths. Jack froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. In all his years working around dangerous animals, he had never been this close to a wild lion without the safety of a vehicle, or at least a sturdy fence between them. But something about the way she looked at him, her amber eyes glazed with pain and exhaustion, told him she was far beyond any thought of attacking. She was fighting for her life, and for the life of the cub that was clearly stuck inside her. Before we continue with Jack's incredible story, tell me where you're watching from today. Have you ever witnessed something that made you question everything you thought you knew about the natural world? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. Jack had assisted with difficult births before, countless calves born on frozen Montana nights, foals that needed help entering the world, even a few exotic animals during his time working at a wildlife sanctuary in Texas. But this was different. This was a wild lioness, an apex predator who could kill him with a single swipe of her massive paw, and yet she lay there, vulnerable and desperate, her eyes following his every movement as he slowly, carefully began to approach. The male lion appeared so suddenly that Jack nearly jumped out of his skin. The massive creature materialized from behind a termite mound about 30 feet away, his dark mane rippling in the hot breeze, his eyes fixed intently on Jack. For a long moment, time seemed to stop. Jack stood perfectly still, his hand frozen halfway to his tranquilizer gun, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger an attack. The male lion took 3 steps forward, close enough now that Jack could see the scars on his face, the battle-worn evidence of years defending his territory and his pride. But the lion didn't charge. Instead, he did something that Jack would later struggle to explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. The great beast looked from Jack to the lioness and back again, and then incredibly he sat down. It was a gesture of trust that defied everything Jack had been taught about wild animal behavior. A moment of understanding that passed between two very different creatures who both recognized that the female needed help beyond what natural instinct could provide. Jack took a deep breath and continued his approach, speaking in the low, calm voice he had always used with frightened animals. The lioness watched him come, her breathing shallow and rapid, her body trembling with the effort of her prolonged labor. When he knelt beside her, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her exhausted body, she made no move to defend herself. Instead, she laid her massive head on her paws and closed her eyes, as if surrendering to whatever fate this strange, two-legged creature might bring. Up close, Jack could see the problem immediately. The cub was positioned wrong, probably breech, and without intervention, neither mother nor baby would survive the next few hours. He had his veterinary kit in his saddlebag, basic supplies that he always carried for emergencies with the ranch cattle, but nothing specifically meant for treating a wild lion. Still, birth was birth, whether it was a cow or a lioness, and the principles remained the same. He just had to work quickly, carefully, and hope that the male lion's patience would hold long enough for him to do what needed to be done. Jack pulled off his leather work gloves and reached for the antiseptic in his kit, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The lioness opened her eyes as he began to examine her, and in that moment Jack understood something profound about the connection between all living things, about the universal language of suffering and compassion that transcended species and instinct. The examination confirmed Jack's worst fears. The cub was not only breech but also slightly twisted, wedged in a position that made natural delivery impossible. Every contraction the lioness experienced was simply exhausting her further, without making any progress toward bringing her baby into the world. Jack had seen this before in cattle, and he knew that time was the enemy here. The longer the cub remained stuck, the less chance either of them had of surviving this ordeal. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and tried to calculate how long the lioness had been in labor. Based on her level of exhaustion and dehydration, he guessed at least 12 hours, possibly longer. The male lion remained seated about 20 feet away, a silent guardian watching every movement Jack made with those intense amber eyes. It was the strangest working condition Jack had ever experienced, performing emergency veterinary work under the watchful gaze of one of nature's most efficient killers, knowing that one wrong move, one moment that might be perceived as causing unnecessary pain to the female, could end with those powerful jaws around his throat. Yet something about the male's posture suggested patience, an understanding that went beyond mere animal instinct. It was as if he knew that this human represented his mate's only chance at survival. Jack spoke quietly as he worked, more to calm himself than with any expectation that the lions would understand his words. He explained what he was doing, how he needed to try to reposition the cub, how this might hurt but was necessary to save both their lives. The lioness's breathing grew more labored as he began to work, her body tensing with each careful manipulation. Jack had to be gentle enough not to cause injury, but firm enough to actually move the cub into a better position. It was a delicate balance that required years of experience and a steady hand that refused to shake despite the danger of his situation. The heat was becoming oppressive, the African sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky, turning the savanna into a furnace that baked everything beneath it. Sweat poured down Jack's face and back, soaking through his shirt, making his hands slippery as he worked. He wished desperately for water, both for himself and for the laboring lioness, but his canteen was back with Sadie, and he didn't dare leave now, not when he was making progress, not when every minute counted. The male lion seemed unbothered by the heat, sitting there like a statue carved from tawny stone, his tail occasionally twitching, but otherwise remaining perfectly still. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Jack felt the cub shift. It was subtle, just a small change in position, but it was movement in the right direction. He continued working, sweat dripping from his nose onto the dry grass, his back aching from the awkward position, his arms trembling with fatigue. The lioness groaned, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of her being, and Jack felt a surge of determination. He had come this far. He had risked his life to help this magnificent creature. He would not fail her now. The breakthrough came suddenly. One moment the cub was wedged immovably, and the next it had turned, slipping into a position that would allow the lioness's natural contractions to do their work. Jack pulled his hands away and sat back on his heels, watching as the lioness's body took over, her instincts guiding her through what needed to happen next. The male lion stood up, taking a few steps closer, his massive head lowered as he watched his mate labor to bring their offspring into the world. Jack used the moment to catch his breath and check on Sadie, who was still tied where he had left her, nervously dancing in place, but holding her ground like the reliable partner she had always been. He considered going to get water, but decided against it. The birth was happening now, and he needed to be present in case complications arose. The lioness pushed, her whole body straining with effort, and Jack could see the cub beginning to emerge, still enclosed in its birth sac, tiny and helpless and utterly dependent on what happened in these next crucial minutes. The cub slid free suddenly, falling onto the dry grass in a wet heap. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The cub didn't move, didn't make a sound, and Jack felt his heart sink. Had they been too late? Had the prolonged labor caused irreparable damage? But then the lioness turned, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, and began to lick her baby with long, rough strokes of her tongue. She cleaned away the birth sac, stimulating the tiny body, encouraging it to take its first breath. The cub's first cry was thin and weak, but it was the most beautiful sound Jack had ever heard. The tiny creature, no bigger than a house cat, mewed plaintively as its mother continued to clean it, her ministrations growing gentler as the cub began to respond more strongly. Within minutes, the baby was squirming vigorously, already searching for its first meal, guided by instincts millions of years old. The male lion moved closer still, his enormous head lowering to sniff his offspring, and Jack saw something in that gesture that looked remarkably like tenderness. Jack remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe as he watched the family scene unfold before him. The newborn cub, its fur still damp and matted, nuzzled against its mother's belly, instinctively seeking the warmth and nourishment it needed to survive its first hours in this harsh world. The lioness lay on her side, exhausted but alert, her eyes half closed as she allowed her baby to nurse. Every few seconds she would lift her head to lick the cub, that rough tongue cleaning and stimulating, ensuring that life continued to flow through the tiny body she had fought so hard to bring into existence. The male lion settled down beside his mate, close enough that their bodies touched, a gesture of protection and solidarity that transcended the supposedly solitary nature that textbooks attributed to male lions. Jack had read plenty of wildlife literature during his 2 years in Africa, had attended lectures by conservationists and biologists who claimed to understand the behavioral patterns of these great cats, but nothing he had learned in those sterile academic settings had prepared him for the raw emotion and complex social dynamics he was witnessing under this acacia tree. Slowly, carefully, Jack began to gather his supplies, placing each item back into his veterinary kit with movements so gradual they were almost imperceptible. He needed to leave, to give this family space and privacy, to return to camp and report what had happened. His radio had been buzzing intermittently in his pocket for the past half hour, the ranch manager undoubtedly wondering why he had missed his scheduled check-in. But Jack was reluctant to move too quickly, afraid that any sudden action might trigger the predatory instincts that had been temporarily suspended by the urgency of birth and survival. As he worked, Jack's mind was already trying to process the implications of what had just occurred. He had assisted in the birth of a wild lion cub, had been accepted, or at least tolerated by both parents, during one of their most vulnerable moments. It was the kind of experience that wildlife researchers spent entire careers hoping to achieve, the kind of intimate interaction with apex predators that was supposed to be impossible without years of habituation and careful trust building. Yet it had happened spontaneously, driven by desperate need and perhaps some deeper understanding that passed between species, when circumstances stripped away the usual barriers of fear and instinct. The lioness opened her eyes fully and looked directly at Jack. For a long moment they stared at each other across the few feet that separated them, human and predator, helper and mother. Jack had the strangest sensation that she was thanking him, that somehow she understood that her cub's life, and possibly her own, had been saved by his intervention. It was anthropomorphization, of course, the kind of sentimental interpretation of animal behavior that scientists warned against. But Jack had spent too many years working with animals to dismiss what his gut was telling him. There was recognition in those amber eyes, acknowledgement of a debt that transcended the usual relationship between humans and wildlife. The male lion's rumbling vocalization startled Jack from his reverie. It wasn't quite a growl, more of a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The message was clear. The moment of truce was ending. It was time for Jack to leave. He nodded as if the lion could understand the gesture and slowly stood up, his joints protesting after kneeling for so long in the heat. His legs had gone partially numb, and he stumbled slightly, catching himself before he fell. The male lion's ears flicked forward at the sudden movement, and Jack froze again, his heart hammering. But the lion didn't attack. Instead, he simply watched as Jack backed away, step by careful step, his eyes never leaving the family group. When Jack reached Sadie, the mare whinnied softly, clearly relieved to see him alive and whole. He untied her reins with shaking hands, only now allowing himself to fully feel the fear and adrenaline that had been coursing through his system for the past hour. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the leather straps, and he realized that his legs might not be steady enough to mount without help. Jack led Sadie a safe distance away before attempting to climb into the saddle. When he finally managed to pull himself up, he sat there for a moment, looking back toward the acacia trees where the lion family rested in the shade. From this distance, they looked peaceful, almost domestic, a mother with her newborn and a protective father standing guard. It was easy to forget from here that these were wild predators capable of bringing down prey many times their size, that their survival depended on their ability to kill efficiently and without mercy. The ride back to the conservation ranch took 40 minutes, and Jack used every second of it to try to make sense of what had just happened. His hands still trembled slightly on the reins, the adrenaline slowly draining from his system and leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with the physical effort of assisting the birth. He had faced dangerous situations before, had been kicked by horses, charged by bulls, even treed by a mountain lion during his early ranching days in Montana. But this was different. This had been a moment of pure vulnerability on both sides, predator and human alike, stripped of their usual defenses and forced to trust each other in ways that defied every natural instinct. Sadie knew the way home without much guidance, her hooves finding the familiar paths through the tall grass, while Jack's mind wandered through the extraordinary events of the morning. He kept seeing the lioness's eyes, that moment of recognition and perhaps gratitude that had passed between them. He kept hearing the newborn cub's first thin cry, feeling the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders when he made the decision to intervene rather than ride away and call for help. By the time assistance could have arrived, both mother and cub would almost certainly have been dead. His choice to act, to risk everything on his knowledge of animal husbandry and his faith in the better angels of predator nature, had made all the difference. The conservation ranch came into view, a collection of sturdy buildings surrounded by protective fencing, vehicles parked in neat rows, and the organized chaos that characterized any working operation dealing with large animals and vast territories. Jack could see the ranch manager, David Kimani, standing outside the main office, binoculars in hand, clearly watching for his overdue employee. Even from a distance, Jack could read the tension in David's posture, the way he lowered the binoculars and immediately reached for his radio as soon as he spotted Sadie approaching. By the time Jack rode through the main gate, half the ranch staff had assembled in the yard, their faces showing various mixtures of relief and concern. David strode forward, his expression stern, but the worry evident in his eyes. Jack had been working under David's supervision for 2 years, and in that time they had developed a relationship built on mutual respect and shared passion for wildlife conservation. David was a fourth-generation Kenyan, his family's history intertwined with this land long before the concept of conservation ranches existed, and his knowledge of the Mara's ecosystem was encyclopedic. "Where have you been?" David demanded, though his tone carried more relief than anger. "You missed your check-in by over an hour. We were about to send out a search party." Jack dismounted, his legs still shaky, and handed Sadie's reins to one of the stable hands who had rushed forward to help. He took a long drink from the water bottle someone thrust into his hands before attempting to explain. "You are not going to believe what just happened," he said, his voice rough from thirst and strain. "I am not sure I believe it myself." The story tumbled out of him, the details spilling forth in a rush that left his audience staring in stunned silence. He told them about the Lioness's distress calls about approaching despite every safety protocol screaming at him to keep his distance. He described the male lion's incredible behavior, that moment of apparent trust that had allowed Jack to work without interference. He explained the complicated breech birth, the careful repositioning of the cub, the agonizing minutes waiting to see if the tiny creature would survive. And he spoke about the moment when the cub took its first breath, when the lioness had looked at him with what he could only describe as gratitude. David listened intently, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement as the story unfolded. Several of the other staff members were shaking their heads, clearly struggling to accept what they were hearing. One of the younger rangers, a man named Joseph who had grown up in a Maasai village on the edge of the Mara, finally spoke up. "The old ones tell stories like this," he said quietly, "about the time before, when humans and animals understood each other better, when there was respect between the hunter and the hunted. My grandfather said there were men who could walk among the lions because they honored the balance of nature. Most people think these are just myths." Jack felt a chill run down his spine despite the oppressive heat. He had heard similar stories during his time in Africa, tales that seemed to belong more to legend than reality, stories of a time when the barrier between human and animal was less rigid, more permeable. He had always dismissed them as the kind of romantic folklore that every culture developed to explain their relationship with the natural world. But now, having experienced something that defied rational explanation, he found himself wondering if those old stories contained more truth than modern skepticism allowed. David organized an immediate expedition back to the site, assembling a team that included the ranch veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen, along with 2 experienced trackers and a wildlife photographer named Marcus Webb, who happened to be visiting the ranch to document their conservation work. Jack gulped down another bottle of water and climbed wearily back into Sadie's saddle, his body protesting every movement, but his mind too wired to consider resting. He needed to show them, needed confirmation that what he had experienced was real and not some heat-induced hallucination brought on by too many hours under the merciless African sun. The journey back seemed to take twice as long, even though they moved at a faster pace than Jack's earlier solitary patrol. Dr. Chen rode beside him, peppering him with questions about the birth, the cub's condition, the lioness's level of distress. She was a petite woman in her early 40s, originally from Singapore but with 15 years of African wildlife veterinary experience under her belt. Her questions were clinical and precise, designed to assess whether the animals would need additional medical intervention or if nature could be trusted to take its course now that the immediate crisis had passed. Jack answered as best he could, describing everything he remembered about the cub's appearance, the lioness's vital signs as far as he could determine them, the male's behavior throughout the ordeal. But even as he spoke, he found himself editing his responses, leaving out the more mystical elements of the experience. He didn't mention the sense of communication that had seemed to pass between him and the lions, the feeling that they had reached some kind of understanding that transcended species and language. Those details felt too personal, too strange to share with people who dealt in scientific fact rather than inexplicable emotion. As they approached the acacia grove, Jack felt his heart rate accelerate. Part of him worried that the lions would be gone, that the family would have moved to a safer location as soon as Jack had left, and he would have no way to prove his story. Another part feared that something had gone wrong, that the cub had weakened or the lioness had hemorrhaged, that his intervention had only delayed the inevitable rather than preventing it. But the loudest voice in his head wondered how the male lion would react to this group of humans approaching his vulnerable mate and newborn offspring. David raised his hand, signaling the group to halt about 50 yards from the trees. They dismounted quietly, securing their horses and gathering their equipment with practiced efficiency. Marcus already had his camera out, the long telephoto lens pointed toward the shadows beneath the largest acacia. Dr. Chen prepared her veterinary kit, though she made it clear she would only intervene if the situation was dire. The general philosophy of the conservation ranch was to let nature take its course whenever possible, to observe and protect, but not to interfere unless human activity had created the problem in the first place. Through his binoculars, Jack could see the lioness lying in almost the same position he had left her, the tiny cub nestled against her belly. His heart soared with relief. They had survived the first few critical hours. The male lion was nowhere in sight initially, but then Jack spotted him about 30 feet away, partially concealed by a termite mound, clearly standing guard over his family. Even from this distance, Jack could sense the big cat's alertness, the way his ears swiveled toward every sound, his tail twitching with barely contained tension. Marcus began photographing, the rapid click of his camera shutter sounding impossibly loud in the quiet savanna afternoon. Jack watched the male lion's reaction, saw the massive head turn toward their group, those amber eyes fixing on them with an intensity that made Jack's mouth go dry. For a moment, he was certain the lion would charge, that their presence in larger numbers would be perceived as a threat that couldn't be tolerated. His hand moved instinctively toward the tranquilizer gun at his belt, even though he knew that in a flat-out charge, he would never have time to aim and fire before 500 pounds of angry predator was upon them. But the charge didn't come. Instead, the male lion rose to his feet and moved closer to his mate and cub, positioning himself between his family and the group of watching humans. It was a clear statement of boundaries, a warning that was somehow more effective than any roar or aggressive display could have been. David spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He is telling us this is close enough. We should observe from here and not push our luck." Dr. Chen had her binoculars trained on the cub, studying its movements and behavior with professional intensity. "The baby appears strong," she said after several minutes of observation. "Good suckling reflex, active movement, no signs of distress. The mother looks exhausted, but stable." I think Jack's intervention was successful. The cub should survive, barring any unforeseen complications. The words sent a wave of relief washing through Jack so powerful that his knees nearly buckled. He had saved them. Against all odds, against every rational voice that should have told him to stay away and call for professional help, His decision to act had made the difference between life and death for that tiny cub, and quite possibly for its mother as well. He found himself blinking back tears, embarrassed by the emotional response but unable to control it. 2 years in Africa had shown him countless examples of nature's brutality, the harsh reality of survival where the weak perished and only the strong endured. To have altered that equation even once felt like a victory that transcended anything he had accomplished in his previous decades of working with animals. Marcus continued photographing, his camera capturing images that would later be featured in wildlife magazines around the world. He worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that opportunities like this were rare and fleeting, that documenting this moment was important not just for its uniqueness but for what it might teach the broader conservation community about human-wildlife interaction. Between shots, he leaned over to Jack and whispered, "This is incredible. I have been photographing African wildlife for 20 years, and I have never seen anything remotely like this. The male's tolerance of our presence, the trust the female showed you, it goes against everything we think we know about lion behavior." Jack nodded, still watching the family through his binoculars. The lioness had lifted her head and was grooming the cub again, her rough tongue passing over the tiny body in long, careful strokes. The baby mewed softly, a sound of contentment rather than distress, and even from this distance Jack could see the little tail twitching with what looked remarkably like happiness. It was impossible not to anthropomorphize, not to project human emotions onto these wild creatures, but Jack had spent enough time around animals to trust his instincts about their states of mind. That cub was healthy, well-fed, and secure in its mother's care. Whatever happened from here forward, he had given it a fighting chance at life. David was on his radio, speaking in low tones to the main office back at the ranch. Jack caught fragments of the conversation, something about documenting the pride's location, establishing a monitoring protocol, ensuring that other ranch activities gave the family a wide berth during this critical bonding period. The conservation ranch covered thousands of acres, plenty of space for humans and lions to coexist as long as everyone respected appropriate boundaries. This particular acacia grove would now be marked as off-limits for at least the next several weeks, giving the lioness time to recover her strength and the cub time to develop the skills it would need to eventually follow its parents on hunts. One of the trackers, an older man named Coynet who had worked these lands for over 40 years, moved to stand beside Jack. His weathered face was thoughtful as he studied the lion family. "You have been blessed today," he said quietly. "The lions chose to trust you, and that is not a gift given lightly. In my grandfather's time, there were stories of men who formed bonds with specific animals, who were recognized and remembered across seasons and years. Most people think those days are gone, that modern humans have lost the ability to connect with wildlife on that level. Perhaps they are wrong." Jack turned to look at the old tracker, surprised by the serious tone. "Do you really believe that? That some kind of bond was formed today?" Coynet shrugged, his eyes never leaving the lions. "I believe that animals know things we cannot explain with science alone. They sense intentions, recognize helpers, remember kindnesses. That male could have killed you easily, should have killed you according to everything we think we understand about territorial predators protecting their mates. But he did not. He sat and watched and allowed you to save his family. That is not random chance or fortunate timing. That is recognition of purpose." The group remained at their observation point for another hour, documenting everything they could without disturbing the lions. Dr. Chen made detailed notes about the cub's condition and the lioness's recovery, creating a baseline record that would allow them to monitor the family's progress over the coming weeks. Marcus filled his camera's memory cards with images that captured not just the technical details of the scene, but somehow also the emotional resonance of it, the strange peace that seemed to exist in that space between human and predator. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the savanna in shades of gold and amber, David finally made the decision to return to the ranch. The lions needed privacy, and the humans had gathered all the information they could without crossing the invisible line that separated respectful observation from intrusive interference. The horses were restless, eager to return to the safety and comfort of their stables, and the humans were not far behind in that desire. Jack took one last look through his binoculars before mounting Sadie for the journey home. The lioness was resting comfortably, the cub tucked against her belly, both of them breathing the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. The male lion had settled down as well, though his head remained up and alert, ever watchful for threats. As Jack watched, the big cat's gaze seemed to find him across the distance, and for just a moment, their eyes met. Jack raised his hand in a gesture that was half salute, half farewell, acknowledging the trust that had been extended and the responsibility that came with it. That evening, the conservation ranch buzzed with energy unlike anything Jack had experienced in his 2 years there. Word of the extraordinary encounter had spread quickly, and by the time dinner was served in the communal dining hall, researchers, rangers, and support staff from across the property had gathered to hear the first-hand account. Jack found himself at the center of attention, a position that made him distinctly uncomfortable. He was a cowboy, a working man who preferred the company of animals to crowds, and the level of interest in his story felt overwhelming and slightly undeserved. Dr. Chen had downloaded Marcus's photographs to her laptop, and the images were being passed around the room on various devices, each picture generating fresh exclamations of amazement. There was Jack, kneeling beside the laboring lioness, his hands working with careful precision while the massive male sat watching in the background. There was the moment of birth, the tiny cub emerging into the harsh world of the savanna. And there were the aftermath shots, the family resting together, the cub nursing, the parents seemingly at peace despite having just experienced one of the most vulnerable moments in any wild animal's life. A heated debate had erupted among the researchers about what Jack's intervention meant for conservation philosophy. Dr. Helena Rodriguez, the ranch's chief ecologist, argued passionately that humans should never interfere in natural processes, that every intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, altered the delicate balance of evolutionary pressures that shaped wildlife populations. If we save every animal in distress, she insisted, her Spanish accent growing more pronounced with her intensity, we remove the natural selection process that ensures only the strongest genes continue. That cub's mother clearly had some anatomical issue that made birth difficult. In the wild, she might not survive to pass those genes to more offspring. But Dr. Chen countered with equal passion. We are not talking about systematic intervention, she said firmly. This was a one-time emergency response to an animal in crisis. Besides, lions face so many human-caused threats already, from habitat loss to poaching to human-wildlife conflict. When we have the opportunity to save one, especially a breeding female, I believe we have a moral obligation to do so. Jack listened to the debate swirling around him, feeling oddly disconnected from it. What he had done that morning had not been the result of carefully considered conservation philosophy or ethical debate about intervention protocols. He had simply seen a creature in desperate need and responded the way he had been responding to animal suffering his entire life. It was instinct, compassion, and perhaps something else that he still could not quite name. Joseph, the young Maasai ranger, sat down beside Jack as the debate continued to rage across the dining hall. The old ones would say you have become part of that lion family's story now, he said quietly. In our tradition, when someone saves a life, they become responsible for it in a spiritual sense. That lioness and her cub will remember you. Perhaps not in the way humans remember, but in the deep places where animals hold their knowledge of the world and their place in it. Jack turned to look at the young man, intrigued by this perspective that seemed to echo Coynette's earlier comments. What does that mean practically? Joseph considered the question carefully. It means that whenever you are near them, they will recognize you, not as prey or predator, but as something different. A helper, a friend perhaps, though that word does not capture the relationship correctly. My grandfather had such a bond with a bull elephant that used to pass through his village. The elephant would seek him out, would allow him to approach when it was injured or sick. This continued for over 20 years until the elephant died of old age. The possibility that he might have formed some lasting connection with the lioness and her family sent a strange thrill through Jack. He thought about the male lion's behavior that morning, the way the big cat had assessed him and apparently decided he posed no threat, despite every evolutionary instinct screaming that humans were dangerous. He thought about the lioness's eyes, that moment of apparent understanding and gratitude. Could animals really form individual relationships with specific humans based on single encounters? Science said no, that such anthropomorphization was foolish and scientifically unsupportable. But Jack's experience, and apparently Joseph's grandfather's experience, suggested otherwise. Marcus joined their conversation, his camera still hanging around his neck. "I have been thinking about this all afternoon," he said, pulling up a chair. "What happened today was not just remarkable from a conservation or behavioral standpoint, it was also profoundly beautiful on a human level. Jack, you risked your life to save animals that could have killed you in seconds. You did not think about the scientific implications or worry about interfering with natural selection. You just saw suffering and responded with compassion. That is something we have lost in our modern, sanitized relationship with nature." Jack shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "I just did what needed doing," he said gruffly. Any rancher worth his salt would have done the same. But even as he spoke, he knew that was not entirely true. Many people would have ridden away, would have called for help and let professionals handle the situation. His decision to intervene directly had been unusual, perhaps even reckless, and it had been driven by something deeper than professional responsibility or ranching knowledge. The days that followed brought an unexpected transformation to Jack's routine at the conservation ranch. David had assigned him the responsibility of monitoring the lion family, a task that Jack approached with a mixture of professional duty and personal investment that surprised even himself. Every morning he would ride out to the acacia grove, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to observe and document the cub's progress. Dr. Chen had given him a detailed checklist of behaviors and physical markers to watch for, signs that would indicate whether the tiny lion was developing normally or if complications from the difficult birth were manifesting. The lioness seemed to recognize him from the first return visit. As Jack approached on Sadie, staying well outside what he estimated to be the male's tolerance zone, the big female lifted her head and watched him with what appeared to be curiosity rather than alarm. The male lion, true to his protective nature, always positioned himself between Jack and his family, but there was something different in his demeanor compared to how he reacted to other ranch vehicles or personnel who occasionally passed near the territory. It was subtle, a slight relaxation in his posture, a willingness to settle back down after initially rising to assess the potential threat. By the end of the first week, Jack had established what felt like a routine with the lion family. He would arrive at the same time each morning just after sunrise, when the temperature was still bearable and the lions were typically resting after their nocturnal activities. He would dismount at the same spot, roughly 70 yards from the acacia grove, and spend 30 to 40 minutes observing through binoculars, making notes in the journal Dr. Chen had provided. The lions would watch him initially, then gradually return to their normal activities, the cub playing clumsily in the grass while its mother rested, the male occasionally rising to scan the horizon for genuine threats. The cub was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. By day 10, it had doubled in size, its legs growing stronger, its coordination improving with each passing hour. Jack watched with fascination as the tiny creature began to explore the world beyond its mother's immediate vicinity, venturing several feet away before the lioness would gently retrieve it with her mouth. The baby's spots were clearly visible now, the distinctive markings that would fade as it matured, but which currently provided essential camouflage against the dappled shadows of the acacia trees. On the morning of day 12, something extraordinary happened. Jack had just settled into his usual observation position when the cub, apparently full of energy and curiosity, wandered further from its mother than it had before. The lioness looked up, tracking her baby's progress, but not immediately moving to retrieve it. The male lion, who had been dozing in the shade, opened one eye to monitor the situation, and the cub, perhaps drawn by the unfamiliar shape of horse and human, began walking directly toward Jack. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as the tiny creature approached, its movements still uncoordinated and clumsy, its blue baby eyes fixed on him with innocent curiosity. He remained absolutely still, hardly daring to breathe, knowing that any movement could trigger a protective response from the parents. Behind him, Sadie whinnied nervously, sensing the approach of a predator, even if it was just a baby. The cub stopped about 20 feet away, sat down in the grass, and began grooming itself with its tiny pink tongue, apparently deciding that Jack and Sadie were not particularly interesting after all. The lioness rose to her feet and padded slowly toward her adventurous offspring. Jack expected her to grab the cub and retreat to a safer distance, to punish this dangerous curiosity that had brought her baby too close to potential threats. Instead, she walked past the cub and continued toward Jack, closing the distance to perhaps 15 feet before stopping. For a long, breathless moment, they looked at each other, woman and man, locked in some kind of communication that transcended language and species. Then the lioness did something that made Jack's eyes sting with unexpected emotion. She lowered her head in what looked remarkably like a bow, a gesture of acknowledgement or thanks, before turning and gently picking up her cub by the scruff of its neck. She carried it back to the acacia grove where the male lion was now sitting upright and fully alert, having watched the entire exchange with keen attention. The lioness deposited the cub beside its father, then turned back to look at Jack one more time before settling down to resume her rest. Jack sat in the grass, his legs suddenly too weak to support him, his journal forgotten in his trembling hands. He had just experienced something that no amount of scientific training or wildlife expertise could explain away. That lioness had approached him voluntarily, had brought her body within striking distance of a species that represented the single greatest threat to lion survival worldwide, and she had done it not out of aggression or desperation, but seemingly to communicate something, to acknowledge the bond that had formed between them on that morning when he had helped bring her cub into the world. When he returned to the ranch that evening, Jack said nothing about the encounter. It felt too personal, too sacred somehow to share with people who would immediately try to analyze and quantify it. Instead, he simply filed his daily report, noting that the cub continued to thrive, and that the family appeared well established in their territory. But that night, lying in his bed in the small cabin he called home, Jack replayed the moment over and over in his mind, that strange dance of trust and recognition that had occurred between himself and a wild predator. 3 weeks after the birth, the dynamics of Jack's relationship with the lion family shifted in an unexpected way. He arrived at his usual observation point to find the acacia grove empty, the grass where the lions had spent their days now flattened and abandoned. His initial reaction was concern bordering on panic. Had something happened to them? Had poachers discovered their location despite the ranch's best efforts to keep it confidential? Had the family been driven off by a rival pride? Or had the lioness's health finally failed from complications of the difficult birth? Jack urged Sadie forward, breaking his own protocol about maintaining distance, and rode directly to the spot where the family had been living. The scent of lion was still strong, marking this as their territory, but there were no signs of struggle or violence. Just the normal debris of 3 weeks of occupation, scattered bones from successful hunts, flattened grass where they had rested, and the distinctive smell of big cats that had claimed this space as their own. Jack dismounted and examined the ground carefully, his ranching experience allowing him to read the story told by tracks and disturbances in the earth. The trail was clear once he knew what to look for. The family had moved north toward the rocky outcropping that marked the boundary between the conservation ranch and the adjoining tribal lands. Jack knew that area well, had ridden patrol there dozens of times. It was good lion country with plenty of cover, reliable water sources, and abundant prey. The move made sense from a wildlife management perspective. The cub was now old enough to travel short distances, and the acacia grove, while safe for a newborn, was perhaps too exposed for a growing family that needed privacy and security. Jack followed the trail on foot, leading Sadie behind him, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of the lions. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down with relentless intensity, and he was beginning to think he had lost them entirely when he heard it. The sound was faint at first, almost lost in the whisper of wind through the grass, but unmistakable once he focused on it. The cub was calling, not in distress exactly, but with the insistent mewing of a young animal demanding attention from its parents. The rocky outcropping rose before him, its weathered stone face offering dozens of crevices and caves that would provide shelter from both the sun and potential predators. Jack approached cautiously, every sense alert, knowing that the male lion would be even more protective in this new territory, less accustomed to Jack's presence and therefore more likely to perceive him as a threat. He tied Sadie to a sturdy acacia about 50 yards back, not wanting to risk his faithful horse in case things went wrong, and continued on foot toward the source of the cub's calls. He found them in a shallow cave about 15 feet up the rocky slope, a natural shelter that offered protection from the elements while providing a commanding view of the surrounding territory. The lioness was visible at the cave's entrance, her body relaxed despite the cub's noisy complaints about something, probably being prevented from wandering too close to the edge. The male lion was nowhere to be seen initially, but Jack knew better than to assume he was alone. That big cat was somewhere close, watching and evaluating, deciding whether this human who had helped his family was still to be trusted or had now become a threat to be eliminated. Jack sat down on a rock about 30 yards from the cave and waited. He made no attempt to approach closer, no threatening moves that might be misinterpreted. He simply waited, patient and still, the way he had learned to wait when working with frightened horses or traumatized cattle. Animals responded to patience in ways they never responded to force or haste. If the lions wanted him to see their new home, they would let him know. If they wanted him to leave, that message would be equally clear. The male lion emerged from behind a boulder to Jack's left, so close that Jack nearly jumped despite his years of experience around dangerous animals. The big cat must have been there the entire time, watching Jack's approach, assessing his intentions, deciding whether to attack or allow this intrusion into their private space. Now he stood in full view, magnificent in his prime, the morning sun catching the darker tones of his mane and turning them to burnished gold. He looked at Jack for a long moment, then turned and walked to the cave entrance, settling down beside the lioness in a posture that was clearly protective, but not overtly aggressive. The message was clear. Jack could stay, could observe from this distance, but he was not to come closer. The family had moved, had established new boundaries, and those boundaries needed to be respected. Jack nodded to himself, understanding the unspoken communication, and pulled out his journal to make notes about the new location. "Doctor," Chen would need to know about this move, would need to update the conservation maps to reflect where the family was now living, and would need to ensure that other ranch activities gave this area the same wide berth that the acacia grove had received. As Jack sat making his observations, the cub appeared at the cave entrance, its confidence and coordination noticeably improved from just a week earlier. The tiny lion peered down at Jack with those bright blue eyes that would eventually change to amber, and Jack felt a surge of pride that was almost paternal in its intensity. This little creature, who should never have survived, was now thriving, growing stronger every day, learning the skills it would need to eventually take its place in the complex social structure of lion pride life. 6 months passed in what felt like both an eternity and the blink of an eye. Jack continued his morning visits to the rocky outcropping, watching as the cub grew from a helpless infant into a boisterous juvenile who spent hours practicing hunting techniques on patient parents and unfortunate insects. The little lion, whom Jack had privately named Hope, though he never spoke the name aloud, developed a personality that seemed to blend the mother's calm intelligence with the father's commanding presence. By the time Hope reached 6 months old, she was nearly the size of a large dog, her baby spots fading into the tawny coat that would eventually mark her as an adult lioness. The relationship between Jack and the lion family had evolved into something that defied every conventional understanding of human-wildlife interaction. The male lion, whom Jack had come to think of as guardian, no longer rose to assess him as a threat when he approached. Instead, the big cat would simply open one eye, verify that it was Jack and not some other human, and return to his rest. The lioness, whom Jack called Grace in his private thoughts, sometimes walked to the edge of her territory when she spotted him arriving, as if greeting an old friend who had come to call. Most remarkably, Hope showed no fear of Jack whatsoever. The young lion would bound down from the rocks when she saw him, stopping just outside what would be petting distance for a domestic animal, and watch him with bright, curious eyes. She never approached close enough to touch, and Jack never attempted to bridge that gap, both of them understanding instinctively that some boundaries existed to protect the wildness that made her who she was. But there was recognition there, a bond that transcended the normal predator-prey, human-animal divide. Dr. Chen had documented the family's progress meticulously, creating what she called the most comprehensive study of early lion-cub development in the wild that had ever been conducted. Marcus's photographs had been published in National Geographic, drawing international attention to the conservation ranch and its unique approach to wildlife management. Researchers from universities around the world had contacted David, requesting permission to study the lion family and the unusual relationship they had developed with a human caretaker. But David, to his credit, had refused most of these requests, understanding that what made the relationship special was its organic nature, its freedom from scientific interference and academic scrutiny. One morning in late January, exactly 6 months after that dramatic birth under the acacia tree, Jack arrived at the rocky outcropping to find the family preparing to move again. Grace was restless, pacing at the cave entrance while Guardian surveyed the landscape with an intensity that suggested big changes were coming. Hope, now gangly and awkward in the way of teenage predators everywhere, seemed confused by her parents' behavior, alternating between trying to play and trying to understand what was happening. Jack understood before he consciously processed the signs. The family was leaving, moving beyond the boundaries of the conservation ranch into the vast wilderness of the Masai Mara proper. Hope was old enough now to travel longer distances, and Grace was likely pregnant again, her body showing the subtle signs that Jack's experienced eye had learned to recognize. The family needed more space, needed to establish themselves within a larger pride structure, needed to follow the ancient patterns that had governed lion society for millennia. He sat on his usual rock and watched as they prepared to depart, committing every detail to memory. The way Grace nuzzled Hope with unmistakable affection, the protective stance Guardian took as he scanned the horizon, the play of morning light across Hope's maturing coat. These were the last moments of a chapter that had changed Jack's understanding of what was possible between humans and wild animals, and he wanted to remember everything about it. Grace was the first to approach him, walking down from the rocks with that fluid, powerful gait that spoke of perfect evolutionary design. She came closer than she had in weeks, stopping just 10 feet away, and looked at him with those amber eyes that had first captured his attention 6 months ago when they were glazed with pain and desperation. Now they were clear and calm, filled with what Jack could only interpret as gratitude and farewell. She held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and called softly to Hope. The young lioness bounded over to her mother, then looked back at Jack one final time. In that look, Jack saw the future, a strong, healthy lion who would hunt and breed and perhaps one day give birth to cubs of her own. She was alive because of a choice he had made, a moment of compassion that had defied logic and safety protocols and conventional wisdom. Whatever else happened in his life, whatever other work he did or places he traveled, he would always have this, the knowledge that he had made a difference when it mattered most. Guardian was the last to leave. The big male rose to his full, impressive height and walked to where Grace and Hope waited at the edge of their territory. Then he too turned back to look at Jack. And in that moment something passed between them that was older than language, older than civilization, older perhaps than humanity itself. It was recognition of shared purpose, acknowledgement of mutual respect, a warrior's salute between two beings who had faced danger together and emerged stronger for it. Then the family walked away across the golden savanna, 3 silhouettes growing smaller against the vast landscape, until finally they disappeared into the shimmering heat waves that danced above the grass. Jack sat alone on his rock, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face, knowing that he had been part of something miraculous, something that would stay with him for the rest of his days. The sun climbed higher in the endless African sky, and somewhere in the distance a lion roared, the sound carrying across miles of wilderness, speaking of survival and family and the eternal cycle of life on the savanna. Jack smiled through his tears, whispered a quiet goodbye to the family that had trusted him with their most vulnerable moment, and turned Sadie toward home, his heart full of gratitude for having witnessed what few humans would ever see, the incredible moment when a cowboy helped a lioness who couldn't give birth and something truly incredible happened.